Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Putnam, the museum's Edward W. Kane Executive Director, and what a treat it is for me to welcome Charles Gibson, Dr. Timothy Johnson, and all of you here in the audience and those watching online to Concord. We all know Charlie Gibson through his long and distinguished career with ABC News, where beginning in 1975 he served as a general assignment reporter, House of Representatives and White House correspondent, host of Good Morning America, beginning for 18 years, and ultimately as the anchor of World News with Charles Gibson from 2006 to 2009. Just this month, he returned to ABC, where he now hosts a podcast for ABC Audio with his daughter, Kate Gibson. The podcast, titled The Bookcase, features conversations with independent bookstore operators, books industry insiders like Oprah Winfrey, and authors like John Irving, Niall Williams, and Sue Miller. As some of you may know, Sue Miller gave a reading here last fall, and Charlie and his wife Arlene traveled up from Falmouth to attend, which was in part the genesis of tonight's event.
And we booked Sue that night.
There was a little bit of self-interest.
We didn't have a home for the book podcast, but I said, if we get it, you got to be on it.
I should note that Charlie and I have a mutual friend, Deborah Leff, a former ABC News producer, who I believe is watching tonight. So here's to Deborah, and who first brought Charlie to the Kennedy Library when Deborah and I were working there together. Now, as federal employees, we had a policy at the library that's quickly summed up as open to one, open to all, which meant if one researcher got access to a document in the archives, then every other researcher also had that same right. Similarly, when Senator Kennedy's body lay in repose at the library, all three networks asked to broadcast live. I was director at the time and followed our open to one, open to all protocol, but we did have some discretion in choosing each anchor's location. So Charlie broadcast from inside the library's signature glass pavilion, while Brian Williams and Katie Kirk battled the winds.
They were out on the water. They were out on the water.
Boston Harbor outside of the building.
They were standing on a paddle board.
For those of you who woke up to Good Morning America for years, that is likely perhaps where you were first introduced to Dr. Timothy Johnson, who beginning in 1975 became the show's medical editor. Preceding that posting, others here, I'm sure, recall him hosting an Emmy Award-winning half-hour weekly series called House Call, answering health-related questions from viewers and interviewing doctors and nurses right here on Boston's own ABC News affiliate, WCVB. In over 3 decades at ABC News, Dr. Johnson reported for World News Tonight, Nightline in 2020. Before retiring in 2012, he currently lives with his wife just next door in Lincoln. And lastly, our internal bias at this museum towards ABC News is also based on the fact that the irrepressible Cokie Roberts spoke here on her book on our nation's founding mothers, and then, in part to honor and celebrate her memory and legacy, we featured her husband Steve this winter speaking about his new book, Cokie, A Life Well Lived. Charlie and I were emailing this week about the format and the timing of tonight's conversation when I paused and realized my emails were totally unnecessary, since no one knows better than Charlie how to command a stage, engage an audience, and craft a delightful conversation. And fortunately, Charlie, there's no need to manage weaving in breaks for commercials. Nor is there cause for any makeup, lights, or musically themed intros, but let me use my best off-camera voice to announce, coming live from the Concord Museum studios, Charles Gibson and Dr. Timothy Johnson.
You don't think there's need for makeup? Oh,
more than ever we need.
Boy, do we need it. It's very nice to have you all here. I love this museum. When Sue was here with her husband to give us talk, Tom was nice enough to take us around. It's a blessing for this community to have this, and you're all lucky to be in the area and have this museum. Tim and I talked about, we are going to take questions at the end, and Tom mentioned that Tim had a call-in show where you could ask questions we're delighted to have questions for Tim. But if you have a little crick in your back, or if you've got a sore neck or something, I would hold those questions till later. Although he's very good at that kind of stuff. But we thought we would take about 15 minutes each to talk about how we got in the business, a little bit about what we think has happened to the news business, and then spend some time talking about the biggest story that we ever covered, and how meaningful that was. And we flipped a coin, and I thought Tim won, but he said, no, you got to go first. But some introductory remarks, Dr. Johnson, please.
Introductory remarks.
Just a couple.
A couple.
Okay,
Well,
that's enough.
Okay. We bantered like this all the time, often live on television, and we never got kicked off, so I guess we'll do all right.
Anyway, somebody asked outside, which made me feel maybe that we've adopted the correct sort of itinerary for the night. But they asked, how did you get from where you went to college into television? And the answer is that I didn't get into the law school where I wanted to go. And I was only applying to law school or thinking about law school because I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And the person who did me the biggest favor was probably the admissions officer from Yale Law School, who visited Princeton, where I was a senior, and we had a very nice conversation, and then he asked me about my grades. As soon as he asked me about my grades, I knew I wasn't getting in. And as we finished the conversation, he says, very nice to meet you, Mr. Gibson. With all due respect, and that's a phrase I learned, that you should, if you're going to ask a president or somebody a nasty question, you just say with all due respect. Doesn't get you very far, but anyway. He said, with all due respect, I'd save your application fee. Now, that's really cutting you off at the pass. So I figured out I had to do something else. And my dad was a news junkie. And at dinner every night, I was expected to know what had been on the front page of the Washington Post and Times Herald, as it was called then, and be able to talk about it. And it wasn't a formal grilling, but I was expected to know basically what had been there. And I was fascinated by it. We used to watch Huntley Brinkley together every night. My mother thought I had reached the pinnacle of success when she found out that David Brinkley knew my name. But I went in my senior year to the library, and I got out what was then the Broadcasting Magazine yearbook. And it had listed all of the correspondents for CBS, NBC, and ABC. There were no cable operations in those days. And I realized there were about 120 correspondents for the three networks. And I thought, this is somewhat of a quixotic notion that you want one job out of a universe of 120, when many law firms have that many partners. But that was my goal. And I was sent to, I got a job at the princely sum of $325 a month at Channel 7 in Washington. The Princeton name carried some, I had some weight, I guess, and for $325 a month. The slogan, the motto of Princeton is Princeton in the nation's service and in the service of all nations. I think that's somewhat highfalutin, but anyway, that's their slogan. And as a trainee at Channel 7, one of my first jobs was to floor the program, be the stage manager for Claire and Coco. Coco was a poodle, often incontinent, and Claire was a woman who thought she was a big deal because she was segueing cartoons at 11 o'clock in the morning for kids, I guess, who hadn't gone to school that day. Anyway, Coco was often incontinent, and guess who got to clean up? Princeton in the nation's service. Anyway, they sent me to a small station in Lynchburg, Virginia, to learn my craft, where they owned a station. And it was a blessing to be there, much as I resisted it, but it was a blessing to be there because Lynchburg was going through school deseg. and it was a great story to cover. It was a bigoted community, but it had an enlightened school board run by somebody who had come down to run the local GE plant from Schenectady. And we really immersed ourselves in the community. The newspaper at the time, the Lynchburg News and Daily Advance, would not publish a story about an African-American person. Would not. If you were black, you could buy your birth announcement, you could buy your death announcement. If you were convicted of a crime, you would be Charles Gibson, comma, a Negro, comma, was convicted today of whatever. If you were acquitted, the story wouldn't appear. It happened because somebody at the local black high school, Dunbar High School, had roughed up one of their photographers, and at that point they stopped publishing stories about black. So we decided we'd cover the black community as well as the white community. And I was there for 3 years, and I became somewhat controversial. The newspaper began to write articles calling me a socialist and a this and a that, because we were doing what you should do as a reporter. And so the station in Washington called me back to work there. And when I left town, I was about 10 miles out of town going up to Washington, where we'd rented an apartment. And I realized that all 4 of my tires had been slashed. It was a time. And I was very pleased when I was in the chair for ABC anchoring the 2008 election. 2008, that was Obama. Lynchburg, until about 11:45, was voting for Obama. And I thought, that's amazing progress. They wound up voting for McCain, but it was narrow. So I got called back to Washington, worked there for a few years. The manager of the station in Washington called me in and said, "You're too preppy for television," and consigned me to radio, essentially saying, "You have a face for radio." So I did that for a while, but then I took a fellowship at the University of Michigan. I got hired by an independent news organization out of the University of Michigan year. I covered Watergate, the trials I covered impeachment, Nixon impeachment at the Judiciary Committee, and for that independent organization, and then the trials of Mitchell, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and the two people don't remember, Martin and Parkinson. And I competed in all those stories with Sam Donaldson, and Sam recommended me to ABC. They hired me. I was in relative obscurity covering the House of Representatives, but it was the only Democratic body in the city at that time. Reagan was president, Republicans had the Senate, Howard Baker was the majority leader of the Senate, and Tip, who was a wonderful character and still I think my favorite politician to cover. An old Irish pal, and in the best sense of the word, and who did not understand television, didn't have a clue what we were about, but got sort of intrigued by it in the later days of his speakership. And from that, Joan London spotted me when David Hartman was leaving GMA. Joan recommended me to the powers that be there, and for 19 years I had the privilege of saying 4 times a day, "Good morning, America." And I will tell you that still, as often as I've said it and as much as I had a chance to do that for all those years, it's still the best named program in the history of television. And you are at people's breakfast tables. And the amazing part of that television at that time, Joan and I, and then Diane and myself, were on camera together. Out of 120 minutes of television, we were on camera together probably 9 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we would go off and do our individual segments and whatever. But interestingly, though we would spend 90% of our time worried about the content of the program and who did we have and who were our guests and what we would be talking about, the news of the day, 90% of the reaction to the show, interestingly, and I think it's because of the time of the day it was on, 90% of the reaction to the program would be about our relationship personally. And even though we were on camera for such a little amount of time, people invariably got it. They knew exactly how we related to each other. Somebody came to me and said, this is going to sound sexist, so I apologize to every woman in the room. People said to me, you're the male host, you've got to be the dominant person, you've got to be the alpha personality, as David Hartman was, and as Bryant Gumbel was at the time with Jane Pauley. And I said, I think it's exactly the opposite. Neither one of us are an alpha personality. We are not husband and wife, we're basically brother and sister. This is a very platonic relationship. But we're brother and sister, and essentially, it is the woman who runs the house in the morning. That's my sexist part. I apologize for it. But essentially, that's true. You know, she's putting together the lunch boxes. She's getting the kids out. She's making sure that the shirt matches the pants or not. But getting the kids out. And so I thought Joan was essentially the most important person. But I used to say, I just hope they look at you and listen occasionally to what I have to say. And we had a wonderful relationship for 11 years. And then we fell behind in the ratings, and so they fired us. I didn't know what I was going to do. And then the people who succeeded us failed. And they came to me and said, would you go back? And I said, no, my time is over. And they said, well, Diane Sawyer would like to work with you. And I thought, ooh, she's they got a lot of money invested in her. Maybe they'll give me a raise. And so we did it for 6 years together. And then Peter Jennings got sick. I was ready to retire after wonderful years at GMA. I wanted to work 3 or 4 more years, and then I was going to get out. And Peter got sick, and they came to me and said, would you do the evening news? And because Dad and I used to watch the evening news together back with Huntley Brinkley, I thought, my basic, if I have any theory in life, it's that you spend your entire life trying to prove to your mom and dad that you're worth a damn. And I thought Dad would really be proud of this. And so I had evening news for 4 years, and as Tim and I often say to each other, we had the best run, as we'll talk a little bit about, because like everybody who leaves a profession, well, it was better in my day. But I think it was. You're up.
So 3 weeks, maybe a month before I was to graduate from medical school in the spring of 1969, I went down to watch the evening news in the student lounge. The Huntley Brinkley report was on that night. And it just so happened they carried a report from Chicago where that day the AMA had held a press conference to announce their opposition to the proposed appointment of a Dr. John Knowles, then head of the Mass General Hospital here in Boston, to become Undersecretary of Health because they opposed his views on universal health care. And had the AMA held auditions to find the worst possible spokesperson for their cause, they couldn't have done better than the ancient trustee they put before the camera. He was so bad that when he was done and the press started asking him questions, they had to lead him off the stage. He just discombobulated. And they came back to Huntley and Brinkley, and I tell you, this is the truth, they were both laughing so hard, they had to go to a commercial break to regain their composure. The next morning, obviously by coincidence, in my mailbox at the medical school, there was a form letter from the AMA inviting me to join as an about-to-be new doctor. And I took that form letter, pure impulse, with a pen or pencil, and said something like, if what I saw in the evening news last night is any indication of your policy and your competency, I do not care to join. Put it in the mailbox, never expecting to hear another word. And I guess about a month later, I got this not form letter, very personal letter from the executive director of the AMA inviting me to join and saying why they were so opposed to Dr. Knowles, and now I was kind of into it. So I sent the letter off, again, impulse, pure impulse, to Dr. Knowles in Boston, never met him, said, you might be interested in this letter from the AMA. And he wrote me back and said, I'm very interested. Thank you for sending it. If you ever end up in Boston, look me up. Well, turns out I did end up in Boston. I looked him up. We became friends. I ended up working at the Mass General. Unbeknownst to me, he was, at that time, part of the group that took over the operation of Channel 5, the new Channel 5 in 1972, WCVB, and they were going to do this program that Charlie mentioned, House Call, and he had heard me give a few talks, and he thought I was pretty good, so he gave them my name, and I got a call from this new station about hosting this program. I had no idea who they were, what they were talking about. John Knowles had not said anything to me, but I figured I better talk to him, so I went out to the station. They interviewed me, and a month later, they offered me the job as host of this program. I kid you not. I walked in on a Monday morning, the second day they were on the air in 1972. The general manager, Bob Bennett, took me into the studio where they were still hanging lights and pounding on the walls, and he said, sit in that chair and look at the red light when it comes on and be yourself. And that was my training. How about that? And the program was successful, and we did some other things, and as Charlie mentioned, ABC noticed me and invited me to join Good Morning America when they started in 1975, and I ended up doing that for 35 years, and then in 1984, finally 9 years later, ABC asked me to join them full-time as their medical editor, and they allowed me to stay in Boston where we had our own studio.
And you were the first network medical editor?
Yeah, first full-time person.
That job didn't exist anywhere?
No, that's correct. And so all of a sudden, I go from being an emergency room doctor to being on television. The way I look at it is if I hadn't watched the evening news that night, I never would have ended up on television. Isn't that the truth? Yeah. You talk about coincidence and circumstance, because that put me in touch with John Knowles, and John Knowles put me in touch with Channel 5, and so I ended up being their medical editor for the next 25 years full-time. And it was, as Charlie has mentioned, the golden era, and we'll talk about that. I'll just say this, that among the many great privileges of that position, and there were many, was the opportunity to work with some true giants in media when you think of the people who were at ABC at that time. You mentioned David Hartman, of course, Peter Jennings, Ted Koppel, and the women that I could work with, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, etc. But I'm going to say this about this man. Admittedly, we're friends, and I am biased, but he's the most versatile anchor, and I worked with them all over the years that I've ever worked with. I don't think anybody else could have done what he did, being on both Good Morning America and the Evening News with equal aplomb. So one of the great privileges of my experience was just getting to know and become friends with Charlie. I'm going to tell you one story about Ted Koppel, just because one of my lifelong goals, I don't know if I've ever told you this, was to try to make him laugh on the air. I don't know why that was a goal, but sick. So one night, he was in Washington hosting, and I was in New York as a guest, and we hooked up, and we were chit-chatting for a few minutes before going on the air, and Ted said to me, so what did you work on today, Johnson? He always called me Johnson. And I said, well, actually, we were looking into some new reporting that prunes are a very effective treatment for the common cold. And he said, really? He said, how does that work? And I said, well, it doesn't do much against the virus, but it makes you think twice before you sneeze. And that's exactly what Ted did. Started laughing, and he barely got it under control by the time he went on the air.
A couple of quick stories. You talk about anchors laughing. I was a local reporter in Lynchburg, Virginia, and ABC in 1968 had hired Barry Goldwater and George McGovern, I think, who ran in 72. Anyway, it was Goldwater and somebody. And they were ABC didn't have any viewers in those days. Harry Reasoner and Howard K. Smith were the anchors. Howard K. Smith was, you never got a laugh out of him. He had talk about somebody with a broomstick up, well, anyway. And Harry had a good sense of humor. But anyway, they had some time to fill, and Harry said, I don't know anybody in this room well enough to tell this story, so you'll have to apologize. Said to this, but this was on the air, said to Goldwater, Senator, some strange things are going on up there on Capitol Hill. Wilbur Mills had this assistant named Fanny Fox, and what's his name? Somebody Hayes from Ohio had Elizabeth Ray. Mm-hmm. And we understand she didn't even know how to type. And Goldwater said, "There's a lot of them up on Capitol Hill. We call them hunting peckers." and Harry collapsed in laughter. And Howard K. Smith didn't break a smile. And he said, "I think it's time to go to commercial." I was watching with a bunch of people in Lynchburg. And the other story I was thinking was you talk about trying to figure out television. When I got offered GMA, I didn't know what the program was about. I'm this serious news guy and whatever. And how do you talk to Dolly Parton if you're the host of GMA just after you've talked to somebody or other from the who's a newsmaker? And Phil Buth, who was the executive in charge of the program, said it's very simple: be curious, have fun. 4 words. And I thought, it's a little bit like the Miller Lite commercials at the time, tastes great, less filling. But be curious, have fun. And I kept that in mind for 19 years doing the program. It was a very good admonition. Speaking of Dolly Parton, she was on once to advertise some diet program that she had undertaken. And she was publicizing, and I kept thinking, how in the hell am I going to make this work? And so I had her talk for about 30 seconds about the diet program. And then I said, "So, Dolly, leads me to the obvious question. How big is your waist?" And she laughed and said, "I'm not going to answer that question, honey." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because I know what the next question's going to be." She was a wonderful guest. The business has changed. And the business has changed largely because of cable and the internet and the fact that we get our news now from so many different sources. I was in a class at the University of Pennsylvania 10 years ago. There's been 120 kids in the room. And the professor said, "How many of you watch the evening news?" One hand went up, one hand. And the evening newscasts are probably a dying institution. When I started, there were probably 30 million viewers a night for the evening news, divided among the 3 shows. It was about 25 million when I left, and it's now down probably about 20, a little less than that. So the competitive pressures that exist on the over-the-air network news departments grow, because it's a business. It's the news business. And ratings are really important. And you see it in what's on the evening news. When I left, if you do a tease, before commercials, stay tuned for such and such, they didn't want you to mention anything overseas. There was a war going on in the Balkans at the time I was filling in for Peter. They said, don't talk about it. If you want to talk about American soldiers, okay. But don't talk about Serbia. Don't talk about the Czech Republic. Anyway, you can't do that because you'll hear the clicks as people turn off. And they now have minute-by-minute ratings. So you can look at the ratings for a news program and you can see by the curve, just in a minute and a half, how many people are going to turn off because they're not interested in the story. So the amount of foreign coverage now, Ukraine is an exception because this is a horrible story and has enormous consequences, I think. But for the most part, you'll see that the programs, it's a little bit of an anachronism that ABC's evening news program is called World News. It's mostly American news. And as Tim said, we were very fortunate that we hit it at the best time. The thing that drives me crazy, Tim and I were talking about it tonight, the destruction of the English language in the writing of the evening newscast drives me nuts. I read an article recently where they analyzed the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the ABC Evening News. He used the word tonight 14 times in 2.5 minutes. And if you watch CBS and NBC, the amount of times they tell you breaking news, although CNN is worse than that, is worse than anything, if it happens at 9 o'clock in the morning, at 6:30 at night, it's still breaking news. And a friend of mine who's a former correspondent for CBS and NBC says, I'm getting used to that breaking news crap, but it's okay because there's going to be full team coverage, which is another phrase that drives me crazy. And the amount of times when in the headlines, the evening anchors will do sentences without a verb or just a gerund, it drives me crazy. And the amount of time now that they'll use video from YouTube or whatever because it's, there was an accident, airplane accident, nobody's killed, nobody's hurt, but it's, fiery airplane crash. They run that kind of video on the evening news. And the amount of enterprise reporting, somebody asked me at a forum like this, what are you proudest of that you did in the evening news? There were two series that I loved that we did. One was we had correspondents fanned them out around the world, and we took 5 reporters in the developing world, and we had them follow a 22-year-old, 3 men, I think, and 2 women, as they lived their daily life. And what was it like to be a 22-year-old in Kenya? What was it like to be a 22-year-old in India? And did they care about the United States? Were they interested in the United States? What was their life like? The 22-year-old in India, a young girl, never forget her, was an executive of a internet company, number 2 executive, and her parents would pick out who she married, still. There was a 22-year-old guy in Indonesia, fascinating. I loved that series. And another series that I loved was we had our reporter in China go in a boat from one end of the Yangtze River to the other. And he basically went from the early 19th century into the 21st century, 22nd century. We're in the 21st. Yeah. We're in the 21st. Boy, are we getting old. But it was fascinating to see the development in China and as that changed, and the talking to families about the one-child policy and and they all wanted their children to go to the cities. Even the rural people wanted their kids to go to the cities. And as a result, agriculture was dying in China because if you only have one child, you want that child to be. Anyway, I loved those series. You'd never do those anymore. You'd never get that anywhere near the evening news. Occasionally, NBC does some good stuff. But we were just very fortunate. We were. I remember one morning on Good Morning America, which was sort of a sign of the times. We had, for the full first half hour, we had Edward Shevardnadze, who was at that point the president of Georgia, but he had been Gorbachev's number 2. And he'd written a book about how they knew that the Soviet system wasn't working and how they had to change it. Wish Putin had read it. And then the beginning of the second half hour, we had Madonna. And then the next guest was William Webster, who was the head of the FBI. And I said to Webster, I can't explain this. We've just gone from Shevardnadze to Madonna to you. He said, welcome to morning television. And he was right. I remember when I was trying out, we had 1/2 hour. We had Edward Cardinal Crowell, I think Edward was his first name, who was the bishop, the cardinal in Philadelphia. And we had, in the same half hour, William Refrigerator Perry, who was a 300-pound running back for the Chicago Bears.
Lineman.
He was a lineman, but he
did run.
the ball.
He did run.
He was something of a phenomenon at the
right.
time. I said, how in God's name am I going to make this work? And the writer says, no problem. I said, why? He said, you just say I got one from the Bears and one from the Cardinals. And I think maybe that line got me the job. I don't know. But we were very fortunate, and it has changed in ways because of the business pressures. It has changed in ways that I think is unfortunate. And you don't need countdown clocks on CNN to get you to watch something if you know it's important. I think the failure to trust the audience for its intelligence is manifest in the news programs today.
So when I started in 1975, there was probably, if one could study it in some way, a paucity of general medical information for the public. Medicine was still a somewhat sanctimonious subject for many people. And so I think we were, in a way, at that time, kind of pioneers in terms of bringing medical information to the public on television. But over the time, of course, that changed dramatically, especially once the cables entered the picture. And now, today, I have to say, I think we are in a very different situation where there is an enormous amount of medical trash information on the information highway. I'm just stunned about the kind of misinformation that people can expose themselves to on the internet and in various cable venues. And we worked so hard in our day to get it right. I mean, we were just absolutely agonizing to make sure we would get it right, both in general news and certainly in my area of medical news. And so I'm just astonished today at the way people put out information that is so wrong and, more importantly, so harmful. And that's changed really in just a couple of decades. And as Charlie said, I think it has much to do with the fact that the airwaves and the internet opened up to any and all comers without hardly any supervision. So I'm not going to dwell on that at great length, but I will, Charlie, I think, segue into what we were going to talk about, the most important story we covered, so we'll still have some time for questions.
But before you move to it,
Yeah.
though, when GMA took surveys of what subjects do you want covered on GMA, because it's, you know, it really had an unlimited palette. And the number one answer would always be health news, always, by a large margin. So that put pressure on us. In 19 years of doing GMA, I never understood, what's the oh God, the word's going out of my head, the thing that women are supposed to take for
Estrogen.
Estrogen. I still don't know if estrogen therapy is supposed to be. One study said it was important. One study said you don't do it. One study said great. 19 years, I never got to a conclusion on that. But it's health news that people wanted, and so there was a great pressure to put on the latest study, whatever it said. And he, since he was nice to me, I'll be nice to him for a change. He was very, very circumspect about what he would talk about on the air. And if the president, for instance, had something or other and he said, I'm not going to talk about that because he's not my patient. I haven't seen him. Until I see some sort of hard and fast report from the doctors, I'm not going to comment on what I don't know. And there was a lot of pressure on you to do that. And some of it from me, you know, we got to do something on that. Well, I'm not ready to do it. And you had to honor that.
And I've said to Charlie and to my family, the one thing that I most treasured from my career was that I maintained the respect of my peers in the medical profession. And that was something that was dear to my heart, very important to me. And that isn't the case today with many people who go on television. Now, I will just say, regarding Dr. Mehmet Oz, I think it's a real tragedy because he was a highly regarded, as many of you know, I think, cardiac surgeon at Columbia for many years, and I knew him in those days. I interviewed him in those days, had high respect for him. And along the way, for many reasons that I do not know, some I do, he pursued fame and fortune instead of medical truth and went to that television program and I think lost his way. So to us, that was very important. But I think I'll segue into talking about AIDS, and then you're going to talk about 9/11. So for me, out of the 25 years I was the full-time medical editor for ABC, there were many huge stories I had to cover, often on the spur of the moment. But for an ongoing story, there was, in my career, nothing like the AIDS saga, which, of course, today has pretty much passed from the news scene because, as we all know, fortunately, there are so many effective treatments today that it has not become the issue that it was in the beginning. But I'm going to tell you just briefly, remember that, I'll start it this way. I was exposed to the very first report of AIDS cases in the United States in a very personally dramatic way. On June 5th, 1981, the weekly report from the CDC, the MMRW report, carried a report of 5 cases of pneumocystis pneumonia in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Just straightforward report, as they always do, just the facts. It just so happened that the next morning I was doing my weekly review on GMA of medical news, so I mentioned that as part of my report that morning. It just so happened that that morning, the then conservative columnist for the Boston Globe, a man named David Wilson, anybody remember that name from the old Globe days? Had chosen to watch all 3 morning programs and write a column about morning television in America. And when he came to Good Morning America, he made his comments. I don't remember what they were generally. But then he said in his column, and our own Dr. Timothy Johnson, meaning Boston Johnson, was on talking about buggery. I never used that word. I wouldn't use it in a million years. But he accused me of talking about that in his column and made fun of me for reporting on these 5 cases. So I wrote him a personal letter and I said, you have every right to your opinions about morning television, but I will tell you that my instinct is that this report, these 5 cases, are going to turn out to be critically important in the future because they're a harbinger of things possibly to come. To his great credit, every year he wrote a column about his worst mistakes, and he always put me first. So I do give him that credit. So I covered that story as it unfolded for those next 15 years and was privileged to work with Tony Fauci a lot. I have high regard for him. We did a lot of day-to-day reporting on that. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details because time doesn't allow it, but I will tell you one other episode in the coverage of that epidemic I will never forget. Some of you may remember that in 1988, Masters and Johnson, the famous sexologists, William Masters and Virginia Johnson, came out with a book about AIDS that was so off the wall, it was astonishing. Hard to imagine that those 2 researchers could have written a book like that. Well, it turned out they didn't write it. It was ghostwritten for them by somebody else who didn't know what he was talking about. And when that book hit the bookshelves, it created a huge stir because it talked about how AIDS could be easily spread by all kinds of everyday normal activities, which was absolutely false, as we know. So Nightline decided they had to do a program that night on the book. So they got Masters and Johnson on, and they asked me to be the guest in opposition to them. So I took the train from Boston to New York, read the book on the way down in the train. By the time I got to New York, I was so mad at what they had done and what they had written and how wrong it was that when I got on the program, I lost my cool. But it was important to do. So much so that after the program, both Roone Arledge and Ted Koppel called me and said, "What happened to you tonight, Johnson?" But it was an example of how tender that subject was and how misleading the information was. And we really had to be on our toes and sharp in contradicting all of the misinformation about that epidemic as it unfolded. Today, it's a different story, thank God, and gratefully so. But it was really a tense time, obviously for the country, obviously for people affected, and for the news media, and I'm proud of the way we handled it for those 12 to 15 years. So that's my most important story.
I remember you coming in one night at World News and saying, we've got to do a story tonight on Robert Kennedy and his article. It was an article at that time, he hadn't written the book, about vaccinations.
He had written an article in Rolling Stone, Robert Kennedy Jr., the anti-vaxxer, that was, again, so misleading that when I read it, I couldn't hardly believe it. I was in New York, I made you read it. He referred in that article to minutes from the Institute of Medicine. So I got the minutes, found out that he had absolutely misquoted the minutes, taken them out of context, rearranged them. I couldn't believe my eyes. I made you read it because I said, Charlie. And I went on the air that night, and I was a little hot under the collar to the point where Peter Jennings, who was home in his sickbed, called me up and said the same thing. What happened to you tonight, Tim?
Yep.
But there were times when you just had to speak the truth. Speak the truth.
We gave Tim 2.5 minutes that night. He took 4.
No.
He, September 11th, Diane and I were on the air, and we were in the 8:30 half hour of the program, and we had run over with the previous segment. It was not Tim's segment. Somebody else had run over, probably me. And we had to fill 2 minutes, and we didn't have a guest that we could put on for those 2 minutes. And we were talking in the commercial about what we would do for the 2 minutes. And Stewie Schwartz, who was the control room producer, said in our ears, something has happened at the World Trade Center. There's fire coming out the side of the building. We have an ABC traffic camera, WABC traffic camera, poised on the building. You're on the air, go. And there we were. And I remember we were madly, first of all, we knew right away that this was no small deal. And so we had to go to special report, which means that Good Morning America airs in pattern in each time zone. So it's always on 7 to 9. So at 8:40, whatever it was in the morning, we were a long time from getting on the air in Los Angeles. So you go to special report, which we interrupt this program for a special report, whatever. And we came out and said something's happened at the World Trade Center, and we had the camera poised on it. And we were madly writing notes because the pictures were of the building. You know, when did the mad shake attack the World Trade Center? And didn't a plane once hit the Empire State Building in the 30s and whatever? I mean, we just have no clue what we were doing. And a reporter named Don Daler lived in the shadow of the World Trade Center, and he called in. He'd heard a high whine and then an explosion. He thought it was a shoulder-fired missile, but it was obviously too big to be that. And we were filling time, trying to explain it. And at that point, when you're in that situation, you just have to say, we don't know any more than you do, folks. You know, we're figuring this out as we go along, or trying to get some line on what's going on. And then the second plane came into frame. And it's amazing how fast your mind works. It was September is forest fire season, and I thought, well, maybe this is a helicopter with one of those big buckets under it, you know. And then that wasn't possible. Maybe it's a traffic helicopter. No, it's too big for that. And then it hit. And Diane and I had different reactions, and we've talked to each other about it since. She wished she'd had my reaction. I wish I'd had hers. She said, "Oh my God." And I said, now we know what's going on. The United States is under attack. And then we went from there, and we waited till Peter got into place. And Peter was there we filled for about 45 minutes. And then Peter got in place, and Diane went down toward the site. ABC had a boat chartered on the Hudson River in the 92nd Street marina. And I was going to get on that, go down the river and try to get a shot from the river. Of course, the police had the whole river shut down. And Diane couldn't get very close to the building either. And then I remember Peter saying in my ear, because I was on the boat, and Peter was saying, "What? What?" The building had come down. So I went back to the studio, and David Weston, who was the president of ABC News, said, "You need to stand by because," first of all, at that point, you go into reporter mode, even though you're on television and you're talking to God knows how many people. But you know, as I say, Diane had the human reaction. I'm thinking, you know, who's responsible? What's going on? How bad is this? And by the time I got back to the studio, one of the buildings was down and the other building was soon to come down. And David Weston said to me, "You need to stand by. You're going to have to fill in for Peter because we're going to be on the air for several hours." And I said to David, "We're going to be on the air for several days." And so we got into a pattern, and we worked all day long on September 11th trying to book guests for the next morning. And it occurred to me when I got in to we started at 6 a.m. the next morning, not at 7, because we were broadcasting for the whole network. Everything was special report at that point. And I remember thinking, you know, we've been working on so hard on all these, we're all going to have the same guests. And for the first time, it occurred to me, what's more important is not necessarily the content of this broadcast, but your attitude on the air. Because we're breaking down here. I remember saying to Diane, if I start to cry, you're going to have to pick it up. And she said the same thing to me. And we both, in that morning on September 12th, it happened. And it happened for me. We had people at every hospital around Lower Manhattan. And they were all calling in saying, there's nobody here. We don't have anything. It was binary. You lived or you died. That was it.
Right.
And that's when I started. I lost it, and it continued that way. We didn't know what to do, so we took a round table, and we put it in the middle of the studio, and we just sat there for the 6 hours we were on the air. We went from 6 in the morning till noon, when the program normally would go off the air on the West Coast, and we had the con in effect for 6 hours. And then Peter would come in and fill in, and then Elizabeth Vargas was going all night. And I remember thinking, it's your attitude that's going to be key this morning. I thought two things. Number one, when I was walking into the studio just a few minutes before 6, I thought the attitude that you adopt is going to be key. You've got to be reassuring. There were 4,000 planes in the air. I remember seeing that statistic. There were 4,000 planes in the air. At the time that happened, they got 4. And as horrible as that was, it's not the end of the world. And we're going to get through this. And that has to be your attitude. And the second thought that went through my head was, your entire life, your entire professional life was preparing for this moment. There is nothing that you will ever do on the air that's as important as what you're going to do this morning. And I felt that way, and I think Diane felt that way as well. And it was an incredible privilege, I guess, to be talking to the country that morning, and in mornings to follow. To be in that position and think, I don't know how it landed on you, buddy, but aren't you fortunate? And this is an enormous responsibility.
I'll just add this note. I was in Boston when it happened. ABC got me to New York, believe it or not, that day, anticipating a lot of talk about injuries. But as you pointed out, there were no injuries. It was binary. So 2 days later, I went back to Boston because there was nothing much I could say, medically speaking. I also want to just mention, Charlie, and we both feel this way, I know, Peter Jennings did an absolutely masterful job anchoring all those hours. And the first day, I was sitting on the set next to him, waiting to talk about what never happened. But to watch him in action, getting all of this information coming from all angles, in his ear and note, masterfully. We both have such high regard for him and what he did that day.
Best broadcaster I ever worked with.
He was incredible. Anyway.
I remember when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And I was in Chicago at a Northwestern football game. My daughter was a student there. And they rushed me to the airport, and I got on the plane. I was on the last plane that got into Tel Aviv. And Peter was already in place. He was on the next to last plane. And I had read every page of research 3 times on that flight, because they, in respect for the Israeli people, they had no flight, they had no movie. Yeah. I watched that goddamn little plane move across the ocean on the screen, and I'm sitting in a middle seat in coach next to a woman. The Milwaukee Hadassah was on that plane, and they were passing out all this food. I was getting none of it because they weren't serving any food on the plane. And so I turned to the woman on my other side and said, this is such a tragedy for the Israeli people, etc. They should have killed the guy years ago, she said. I thought, okay, there's another, not going to talk to her. So I read all this research for hour after hour after hour, getting to Tel Aviv. And I did Good Morning America, and then Peter came on the air. And I swear to God, he knew stuff I don't know where he got it all, but he's talking about the history of the cedar trees on the edge of the cemetery where Rabin was going to be buried, and I mean, he was
This is a man who never graduated from high school.
Never graduated from high school.
But was self-taught and self-read incredibly.
And gave the graduation address at his daughter's high school graduation and started to cry.
Yeah.
I was there. She graduated from Nightingale Bamford in New York. He started to cry because he said to his daughter, "You've done something I never did."
Graduated
And
from
he
high
never accepted the fact. Peter was always the smartest guy in the room. And we would say that to Peter. You're the smartest guy in the room. Why are you so intent on proving to us that you're smart? Because we know it. Anyway, a couple of questions, please. Yeah. We've talked on.
We could sit here and chatter all night, obviously,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
sorry
Telling
about
stories. That in all due respect, by the way. So we're doing a program, Tim was involved in it. We're doing a program at the beginning of Obamacare with, we did an hour in the East Room at the White House with Obama to talk about Obamacare. And they let us do the news in the Blue Room. So we'd done the news, and then we had time from 7 o'clock till noon, till 10 o'clock to kill time. And Obama came down. He just wanted to shoot the breeze. And so we're sitting there talking, and I said to him, with all due respect, Mr. President, we've got an hour to do this show on healthcare, and your first answer at your news conference day before yesterday was 13 minutes long. We can't afford that, and I'm going to have to interrupt you if it gets too long, and I do it with all due respect. And he looked at me and said, "Charlie, your all due respect is noted, but I'm the President of the United States." I don't know quite what you say to that.
So my question is regarding Twitter, and we all know about the, lack of accuracy there, but I'm wondering about your thoughts about the pressure on traditional media about the speed of Twitter and what kind of, pressure that puts on the accuracy of legitimate media.
I'll tell you a quick story. And we're going long, I know. Does everyone want to go home? Because if you want to go home, don't feel badly about it. I was in the newsroom one day. You get made up when you get in. I got in about 8:30. You put your makeup on right away in case you're going to have to go up and do a special report. Somebody came in the newsroom and said, you may remember the story, there's been a bombing at Fort Hood in Texas, or a shooting. It apparently happened in the medical unit, and we think there were two shooters, and they're both dead, and there was minimal loss of life, but we don't know. It looks like a terrorist incident. So I'm upstairs. We're on the air 10 minutes later, and our normal Defense Department, Pentagon correspondent was not in place. And so I'm talking to a producer, and all we've really got is what the Pentagon is saying, which was that there were two shooters, they were both dead, and there was minimal loss of life. And so I'm putting this out, talking to Tom Justo, who was the producer. And a young guy who I'd never seen before came in, and I hear him talking to my researcher who's down below the desk, Nancy Gabriner, somebody who's 3 times smarter than I am. And he was saying to her, "I don't think the Defense Department's right. We're getting tweets that purport to be from the medical unit." I can hear him out of one ear. Purport to be from the medical unit. I think there's just one shooter. I think he's alive. I think they've captured him. And I think there's a lot of people dead. And he was yelling, what is it they yell? Allah Akbar. And so what do you do with that? Tweets. I didn't know what a tweet was. Didn't have a faintest clue what a tweet was. And so when we went to commercial, I turned to the guy and said, "Why do you believe this?" He said, "It just has the ring of authenticity." And I said, "How do we know this isn't Howard Stern screwing around with the news?" And he said, "Howard Stern wouldn't mess with something this important. And I think it's legitimate." Now, 2 weeks earlier, CNN had been on the air with a bad report, which they stuck with for hours, about the Boston Marathon bombing that was incorrect. And I'm thinking, if I go with this and it's wrong, you can put all the qualifiers on it in the world you want to. But if it's wrong, it's your tush, buddy, that's going to be hung with this. I went with it. And it proved to be, the Defense Department changed their story about a half an hour later. This was correct. We got up an hour and a half later after we got off the air. And I said to Nancy, "What's a tweet?" And she told me, and I thought, how did that kid know where to look? I wouldn't know where to look. Even if I knew what Twitter was, I wouldn't know where to look for it. How did he know? And I remember going home that night and telling my wife that story, and I'm saying, that kid who's 21 years old or 22 years old, who I'd never seen before, haven't seen since, knows more about the future of how news is going to be covered than I do. And it's time to retire. Because I don't understand what just happened. And that's true, and it puts so much extra pressure on the people who are on the air live. Now, a lot of people use it well. When you watch CNN's political coverage, you see Gloria Borger or David Chalian or some other people, David Axelrod, saying, I'm getting these tweets from various people that I know.
From reliable sources.
From reliable sources.
That they know.
But now, if you got a phone, you're a reporter. You can take video, you can take pictures that the networks will use, you can tweet, the news is out there. So I'm glad I'm retired, because I don't understand it. And there's a great line that Carrie Fisher wrote in a movie called Postcards from the Edge, which I often think of when you raise a question like this, which is the problem with instant gratification is it takes too long. And that's true now. And the pressure on the anchors to balance this and to be right is really, really hard.
We used to joke about retiring at the same time. It turns out we did for various reasons. But one of the best parts of our timing was we didn't have to personally go on and start tweeting.
Yeah.
That was coming around the corner, and neither one of us wanted to do it.
Every anchor has a social media
that would
account now.
drive me nuts, having to do that kind of stuff.
I don't get it. I'm having to
That
do it
shows
for
you
this,
how old we are.
for this this podcast. My daughter keeps saying, we got to be on social media, Dad. No, you do it.
Yeah.
You do it.
Let's do one more question.
Anybody else? Anybody? Yeah.
So where do you think we're going to get reliable media? Because I feel like now I don't know where to get reliable media. No one's reading newspapers anymore. Concord's going through this whole thing. Where do we get our local media? No one's watching evening news. So what is a reliable source opposed to finding a source that you already believe in and you're trying to find a place where they're reaffirming your own ideas? How are we going to learn in the future?
When I did my little oration as I signed off for the last time on World News, I said, please, people, seek objectivity. It is not in fashion today. Roger Ailes was brilliant in the way he constructed Fox News, knowing that the incredible proliferation of news sources meant that you needed to find a niche audience, that the general objectivity wasn't going to cut it anymore. People wanted to see their own political prejudices reflected in the news that they watched. Roger played to that and made Fox an extraordinarily successful operation. So I don't know how to tell you that. And what worries me is that you see more and more editorialization creeping into the front pages of newspapers that you honored in the past. The New York Times is still the greatest newspaper in the world, but it has now on its front page some things that I don't think should be there, because they feel the need to get into this game. And they have a pretty liberal audience. New York City is a liberal organization, and I suspect most of the people who read the paper across the country are liberal. And that's one of the reasons I'm glad to be retired, because I couldn't have made it any better. Because the pressures on you and the pressures are real and should be there to some extent. What every newsroom in the country went through the question, what do we do about Donald Trump? What do we do about somebody who, I have nothing against his political philosophy. I probably would be somewhat conservative if I were, if I had to express what I believe politically. So I'm not against a conservative president. I'm not against somebody who's against regulation or whatever. But he lied. He just lied day after day after day. And he is responsible for the death, I think, of hundreds of thousands of people because of his response to COVID. And his courtship of Putin, which we're now finding was so misguided. So what do you do about that? Do you call him a liar on the air? Do you take a position that this guy should not be president? He's not equipped to be president. And then what do you do about the phenomenon that 40% of the country thinks he should be president? I don't know how to do that. And so when I say please seek out objective sources, I don't find many that I think are terribly objective these days. I read The Economist, which I find to be a pretty good magazine. I read This Week, or I think it's called The Week.
The Week.
Which is an aggregator, and I think does a pretty good job of aggregating, does a good job of aggravating too, but does a pretty good job of aggregating the news from around the country. I don't know.
And in medicine, I simply say to people, study and know your sources. So there are good sources of medical information. I'll just mention one that everybody should know about called the Kaiser Family Foundation, KFF. Great source of ongoing medical information. And usually the major medical centers that publish their own material, Mayo Clinic, Mass General, et cetera. So in medicine, we still have good sources if you're willing to find out about them, study them, know who they are. I think it's almost better in medicine in that one regard than it is in general information.
But it wasn't, and now with COVID,
Oh, no,
it's become
everything,
politicized.
yeah. So, but those sources still stood out even in COVID if you would go to them and know about them.
Yeah.
I think we all yearn for decent sources that we can trust,
Yeah.
and we have seen that, examples of that tonight with Charlie Gibson and Timothy Johnson. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.